Well, hello there, everybody. Hope you're doing well on this fabulous Tuesday morning. Thank you so much for joining us, hanging out with us here on the Worship Hangovers channel as we're doing our weekday Bible study. And today we're going to continue and kind of finish our conversation on Gideon. And so there's a lot of things that happen today, but really contextually, thematically, even though there's a lot of things that happen in Gideon's story today, they all kind of feed the same point. And so I think that everything today that we're going to talk about all really fits together. So one of the biggest themes that we're going to talk about today is the theme of pride, and how that affects us, and we're going to see how that affects Gideon moving forward in his story. Because remember, as we started Gideon's story, Gideon was pretty trepidatious to start. He didn't necessarily, whenever God called him, he didn't necessarily have all the faith that he needed to be able to do what God was calling him to do. He was very, very shy to say yes to God. And so he actually even asked God for a lot of signs and a lot of reasons why, like, he should believe that God is who he said he is, and that God's going to use him. And it wasn't until he came across a Midian man who had a dream that Gideon finally came to faith that God really was going to use him for what God told him he was going to do. So Gideon starts very, very apprehensive, but what we're going to see today is through the victories that Gideon has seen, he is going to begin to grow to become a whole lot more prideful. So we're going to begin reading at chapter 8, verse 4 today. I'm going to start reading. I'm probably going to read a big section, and then I'll talk about a little bit from it, and then we'll move on. So this is what it says. It says, Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and the 300 men who were with him, exhausted, it says. Exhausted yet pursuing. He's exhausted yet pursuing. So he said to the men of Succoth, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebah and after Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. And the officials in Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your army? So Gideon said, well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. And from there he went up to Penuel, and he spoke with them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. And he said to the men of Penuel, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkar with their enemy, about 15,000 men, all who were left of all of the army of the people of the east, for there had fallen 120,000 men who drew the sword. And Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers east of Nobah, the Jogbah, and attacked the army, for the army felt secure. And Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and he threw the army into a panic. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Okay, so what you can see here is, first of all, Gideon is pursuing these other two kings. Now, keep in mind, something to know is most people agree, most biblical scholars agree, there's a transition in the text that's happened here. Gideon went from this apprehensive man doing what God told him to do to now God is completely silent, and Gideon is now acting on his own accord. These two kings, right? These two kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, they have not been mentioned yet in this narrative story. They obviously were not mentioned by God because God's no longer speaking in this story. So for some reason, Gideon sees it fit, even though he's done what God has called him to do, Gideon sees it fit to continue to pursue these Midianites and to also kill these men. But not only that, Gideon now feels as if he is owed by those with whom he comes into contact. Gideon now feels as if he is owed some sort of privileges, whether that be rations of bread, whether that be water, whatever. And when they withhold them from him, he makes these crazy threats, like, I'm going to, like, put you into the briars. I'm going to pierce you with briars. I'm going to knock down your tower. Like, I'm going to destroy you, and I'm going to destroy your village. Like, he begins to have these temper tantrums, right? And so what we can see here is a man who no longer is acting in accordance with God's will, but now he's beginning to act in accordance with his own will. And that, my friends, that is the beginning of the end. We're going to talk about that more. But acting in accordance with your own will outside of the will of God, that is the beginning of the end. Verse 13, Gideon the son of Joash returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured the young men of Succoth, and he questioned him, and he wrote down for him the officials and the elders of Succoth, 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth and said, Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you already taunted me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted? And he took the elders of the city, and he took the thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them, and taught the men of Succoth a lesson, and he broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, Where are the men whom you killed at Tabor? They answered, As you are, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king. And he said, They were my brothers, the sons of my mother, as the Lord lives. If you have saved them alive, I will not kill you. So he said to Jethro, his firstborn, Rise and kill them. But the young man did not draw a sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, Rise yourself and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength. And Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. So you can see here, like, he's going down this cycle of revenge, right? First, he has revenge on the kings that wouldn't give him bread. He says they taunted him. I don't necessarily read that when I read this text. They didn't taunt him. They were afraid. They didn't know, right? If whose side should you be on, right? If there's a war happening in your homeland and you're not necessarily engaged in it on either side, who do you cater to? And they weren't necessarily going to cater to Gideon, because Gideon hadn't won the war yet, and they weren't sure that he was going to, right? And so what does Gideon do? He comes back and he pierces them with briars, or he destroys their tower, and then he finds these guys, and these guys obviously had done something to Gideon's brothers and killed them, and what does Gideon do? He kills them in return. We see this cycle now happening, spiraling out of control in Gideon's life, of aggravation and revenge, and aggravation and revenge. It's just a cycle that is spiraling out of control, and yet God stands in the distance from this story, silent, as if to show us that Gideon now is acting out of the intention of man and not out of the intention of God. God gave us his intention, and Gideon no longer is acting within it. So we move to the next chapter of Gideon's life, right? Your Bible has a heading there, Gideon's ephod is what I'm going to call it. The men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule over us, because now he's been successful, right? These guys are dead. There's no longer a problem of Midianites. There's no longer this thing happening. Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian, which makes sense. Gideon has stopped acting like a judge, right? Because a judge would take what he's been given, and he would drive out the punishment that he has to drive out, right? And that's what he does whenever he initially begins to fight Midian on accordance to what God has called him to. When he begins to act on his own accordance, he's kind of stepped out of the role of judge, and he's placed himself in the role of king. So it makes sense that Israel would say, Rule over us, be our king, right? The men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. And Gideon said to them, Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earring from his spoil, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, We will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in the city in Ophrah. And all Israel whored after it there. and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more, and the land had rest for 40 years in the day of Gideon. Now, here's what I want you to notice, okay? They said to Gideon, be our king, right? And Gideon, be our king because you saved us from Midian. That's the conversation. Be our king because you saved us from Midian. And what does Gideon do? I will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. But he forgets to remind them that it was also the Lord who saved them, right? In Gideon's mind, a transition has taken place. And it is transition from I, Gideon, am being used by the Lord to do the Lord's work, to I, Gideon, accomplish the Lord's work for him, right? I, Lydian, have done what God himself could not do. And that pride is just beaming out of him, right? He has so much pride that he's willing to ask them for their gold. I want every one of you to give me a piece of gold. And they are so willing, they're so enamored by him that they are absolutely willing to just throw their gold at him, to just give it to him. Here you go. You can take it willingly. Here it is. And then he sets up this ephod, right? He sets up this ephod in the town of Ophrah, and that is really significant. So if you look at that word there for ephod, an ephod is an ephod can be a garment that would be worn associated with tabernacle type situations, right? And we don't necessarily know what this particular ephod looks like. They can take many shapes and sizes. They can be very different in their form. But here's what we do know. They're worn by the high priest, right? They're worn in the high priest in association with the temple and the most holy place, the place where you would go to worship God. And what he is doing is he's setting up a place to go worship God outside of the temple that God has established, outside of the most holy place, outside of the place that God has called them to. He's setting up this place to worship God in Ophrah, right? And what he's really doing is he's setting up a place for the people to come and to worship him. Because this is not what God wants. Remember, our story with Gideon started in Ophrah, and what was his task in Ophrah? To destroy the temple that was there for the Baal, to destroy the Asherah pole that was there for the Baal, right? That was his purpose in Ophrah to begin with. And now Gideon is setting up a monument that the people can come and worship him. And it becomes the destruction, not only of him, a snare for him, but also a snare, it says, for the people of Israel. And though they had peace for 40 years, the story of Israel ends differently under the judge of Gideon than it has of all of the judges that came before him, because the judges that came before him, it says that they pleased the Lord, that they worshiped the Lord, that they followed the Lord, and now they just have peace. Those are very different things, right? A good national leader can bring peace. A godly national leader brings praise. Those are very different things. Verse 29, Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives, and his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech, which means son of the king, by the way. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age, and was buried in the tomb of Joash, his father, at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Pride is the beginning of the cult that lives inside of us. I want you to know that, right? Gideon literally begins a cult. That's literally what happens here. You're watching the beginning, the foundations of a cult being built right there in the presence of Israel's eyes, right? And Israel is falling for the trap. This is a false item, a false deity, a false piece of worship that is going to lead Israel astray. And all of that is born out of the pride of a single person. We can be proud of our accomplishments. We can be proud of how God utilizes us. But the moment that we let any of that take away the glory that should be reserved for God, right? Because remember, Gideon gave God part of the glory. I won't rule over you. God will rule over you. Yeah, but I did defeat those Midianites, didn't I? Right? Gideon gave God part of the glory, but the moment that we take any piece of the glory that should be reserved for God, the moment we apply any piece of that glory to ourselves, that is just pride setting up the foundation of its occult to live inside of us. That's just what's happening there. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up. If you have anything to add to the conversation, I would love for you to do that. Leave us a comment, or if you have any just helpful suggestions, let me know how I'm doing. I'd appreciate that as well. You can subscribe to this channel, and if you do, you can also click that bell icon to receive notifications when we go live. And of course, the thing that I would appreciate more than absolutely anything is if you'd share this video with even one friend that you think would benefit from a little bit of daily Bible study. Until tomorrow, we're going to start a new Judge tomorrow.